Hello, everyone. This is Angela Walton-Raji, and welcome to the eighth episode in this series devoted to researching freedmen of Indian Territory. In this episode, we're going to talk a bit about finding the story, finding the missing story in the family's history. And how do you go about that? Where do you find those stories? And what exactly does one have to do? Does one have to look for to find the story beyond what you find on those Dawes records? So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So let's take a look. Now, many of us already know the joy and the excitement that we get when we find an ancestors enrollment card. Maybe your folks have migrated away from Oklahoma and they now live in California, or perhaps they live in Michigan, or perhaps they live in Chicago, or whatever city, Kansas City. Definitely a destination city during the years of the Great Migration. But when you first start researching, we know that excitement that you get when you find that ancestors enrollment card, part of those Dawes records that we hear about all the time. And whatever the background, regardless of their nation of origin, whether they were Creek freedmen, whether they were Cherokee, perhaps they were Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, it doesn't matter. When we get those cards in front of us, we study them, and we study them intensely. Of course, we know that freedmen cards, we're talking about people who had been freed, either the persons on the card, whose name is on the card, or their parents had at one time been enslaved by 5 tribes that were slaveholding tribes: Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole. And particularly if you research other states outside of Oklahoma, you know the challenge if you have ancestors who were enslaved, the challenge that comes with sometimes identifying the slaveholder. Well, freedmen cards usually identify that. Even if a one generation may have been born free, perhaps their parents had been enslaved. And as a result, that additional information about the freedman on that particular card is usually put on the back side of the card, because freedman cards on those Dawes records, those cards are double-sided. So what's particularly great is that not only do you get information about perhaps who was the person who had enslaved them, but you also get the parents of those individuals who were on the front of the card. So this is always a joy. You may have a great grandparent who was from, in this case, we're looking at the Craig family from Scullyville, and maybe Anna Craig was the ancestor that everybody talks about. But on the back, you get even more information about Anna, and you find out who her parents were. And of course, the parents of everyone else whose name is on the front side of the card. We also know there is the application jacket. That's where you get more information about the family. Now, I want you to realize one thing, though. As I go back to this card, notice questions are asked. Questions are asked about who the person is, their age, of course, their gender. Were they previously enrolled on another card? If they're old enough to have been enslaved, these interviews took place in the 1890s, mind you, but who the slaveholder was, who their parents were on that other side, if their parents had been enslaved, and who they were. So it's so important to realize that information that you do get on those cards. Now, with those cards, don't forget someone had to sit down and interview the person. Who are you? What's your name? How old are you? Where do you live? Where's your post office? And so on. Well, you find that information in the application jacket. And those jackets can be very, very valuable to the family's story, because it has interviews, memos are often found in those records, also sometimes birth, death affidavits. You never know what you're going to find in those files. All kinds of things. I've even seen marriage records sometimes appear in those application jackets. They're full of information. And of course, the purpose of all of this, was not to admit people to a tribe. The purpose was to determine eligibility to receive land allotments. And that's what the whole Dawes enrollment process was. Enrollment, not meaning enrolling as in joining, but enrolling as in putting one's name on a roll, on a list. That's what that meant. So, of course, in those land allotment jackets, you can find, of course, you find the names of each person whose name is on that original enrollment card, but then you find interviews. Sometimes you even find the legal land description, which you're always going to get that. And sometimes you even find allotment certificates. Not in every one, but you do find them frequently in some of those files as well. But there is more. There is more to find. And as a result, of course, you are encouraged to look a little bit more closely. Now, of course, there are records outside of those Dawes records to look for. There are those pre-Dawes records, depending upon what tribe your family may have been from. If they were Cherokee, there's a Wallace roll, there's a Kern Clifton roll. Of course, don't forget the federal census, because they were recorded on the 1900 federal census. That was a census right before statehood. And of course, all those census records after that, they were recorded, because by this time now, Oklahoma's a state, and these individuals, these free people, are now citizens of the United States. Well, there are also military records. Don't forget, we've had 2 world wars in the 20th century. So you do find draft cards frequently as well. And in some cases, I don't know if you've ever looked at them, there are also some Oklahoma school records that have recently been placed online as well. But once again, there's still just a little bit more. And I'm going to use the example of the case of Isom and Julia Jackson. Theirs is an interesting story. Now, it's not dramatically different from other stories from Indian Territory. You're going to find that the records are similar to the records that most families have. You are going to find those enrollment cards. You're going to find those allotment jackets, those interviews that we talk about. And of course, one can definitely extract a very, very good story from those records. And you are encouraged, of course, you're going to begin by finding those records. Now, Julia Ann and her husband, Isom Jackson, they were Choctaw freedmen. And we see their card. They appear on card number 1213. And we see their application as it's coming from Dokesville, which was the community where they lived. And we see, of course, the names of the individuals in the household. We see Isom, we see Julia Ann, the wife, and we see several children in the household as well. We see Willie, we see Ben, we see Anderson, we see Mitchell, we see Josephine, and we see Emma. So again, we're thinking, okay, this is pretty good. Good information, not necessarily different from any other type of enrollment card that you look at. And of course, zooming in, one of the things you'll always notice on cards, not just Freedman cards, but any cards that were part of the Dawes enrollment process, the number to the left always represents their roll number. When people talk about an ancestor having a roll number, that's the number. And that's the number that eventually would be placed on the final row. But over to the right, you see the ages of the individuals, and you see both Isom and his wife Julia Ann. You know, he's 49, she's 51. So they're mature adults. They have children. Their youngest is 6. Their oldest is about 18 years old. So you realize, okay, they've been there for a while. They're not a newly married couple. You also see on the same card, they had been enrolled prior to this particular card being filled out. They were included on the 1896 roll, and they were out of Towson County in the Choctaw Nation. And of course, their roll numbers on that 1896 roll, pardon me, their roll numbers are to the right in that column that says number. But we see even a little bit more. We see some notes at the bottom of the file. And particularly, you'll see something. Number one was originally on the roll as Isom Jackson because he spells his name Isom. Some people might call it Isom, but it was originally written as Isham. And of course, we see that Willie's name was originally written as Wiley. And number two, who was Julia and his wife, you see her name was originally written as Julianne on an earlier tribal roll. So it was Julianne, but it was compressed and written as one word. But the bottom line on those notes, 1 to 8, inclusive, meaning everyone on the front of that card whose name is on the front, they were transferred from a Chickasaw Freedman card number 1124. So they were on an earlier card. So I went and pulled that earlier card number 1124. You see the big stamp canceled across, but there they are, same information. And you see, of course, Isom, you see Julia, Ann, you see Willie, Ben, Anderson, Mitchell, Josephine, and Emma. And you see them all there. And of course, the notation under the stamp, the big stamp that says canceled, saying that, of course, they were transferring them to the Choctaw card number 1213, which is where their names remain. That application, at the bottom right hand, you see a stamp. Well, zooming in, you see that they applied and appeared in front of the commission April 18th, 1899. And that's what's on this Chickasaw card. But interestingly, the Choctaw card, the same date appears. That's kind of different. What, in the morning they were on one card and then changed to another? Who knows? But it is still important to really pay attention to what you're looking at. So all this transpired the same day. And it is quite interesting just to take note of that. But most interesting to me is that the column where the slaveholder is usually mentioned, that slaveholder is not mentioned in this case. It's missing, which is kind of unusual. We know that Isom was 49, the wife was a year or two older, 50, 51. So they had been enslaved, but yet that information is missing on this card. Kind of a different thing and kind of a surprise to see that it's missing. That's the Choctaw card, but look at the Chickasaw Nation card. You see the same information, but on the slave of column, you just simply see the word Chickasaws written down, and that's it. No name, but the fact that, okay, they were slaves of Chickasaws, so be it. And that's kind of unusual because one of the things that you typically find that if nothing else, they declare and want to ascertain that the person had been enslaved by a person in the nation to which they were submitting an application. And that's really quite fascinating to see that. On the back of the card, on the back of the Chickasaw card, you see the names of the parents, of course, the children. Of course, you'll see number 1 and number 2 written on their respective lines. But the first 2 lines, you see the name of Isom's parents, and you see Alan Jackson is his father. He was enslaved, and it tells, of course, he was down in the Kainichi area, and his mother was Phoebe Jackson. And again, mother's owner, no, Chickasaw, and it's just sort of dismissed in that way. Then you see Julia Ann and her parents are mentioned, Bill McGilvery. Well, okay, he's deceased, and simply Chickasaw again. That's kind of different. And the father's owner, well, Chickasaw. It's just written that way. And her mother, Mahala McGilvery. And again, one of the things you see though, it tells you where she had once been in Fort Towson area, and it even puts the mother's owner's name. But looking at Ben McGilvery, he was Chickasaw, and again, you see Chickasaw repeated under owner. What does that mean exactly? Kind of different. You don't see that very often. On the back of the Choctaw card, you see the same thing. You see the parents there, you see Alan Jackson, you see Phoebe Jackson, and then, of course, for Julia Ann, you see Ben McGilvery and Mahala McGilvery. And it just simply says, in terms of who her father was, Chickasaw. Typically, when you see a tribal name, especially if it's left, well, if you see either a tribal name or if the owner is left vacant, sometimes there's a suggestion that perhaps maybe the father was the Chickasaw slaveholder. But we don't know all of those details, certainly not at this time. The application jacket, we know it corresponds to the card. Now in Chickasaw, and the Chickasaw card, we know that the card number was 1124, and we see something there that the information from the jacket in 1124 on the Chickasaw Freedman card was all transferred to the Choctaw Freedman file number 1213. So it's all been consolidated into the one file. As we go and take a look at that file among the Choctaw cards and along those Choctaw allotment jackets, we see an interview. And thankfully, it's not something that was an abbreviated interview or a summary. We see a fairly detailed interview. And you see the questions being asked. What's your name? How old are you? Isom Jackson is replying. He gives that information. Whose slaves were you? And he says, Fanny Lanahy, a Chickasaw. Anybody here know you? Yes, sir. Albert Byrd is here. Then they swore him in and asked if he knew Isom Jackson. How long have you known him? Well, I knew his mother before she was born. Was this man a slave? Yes, sir. Who was his mother? Who was his master, rather? James Lanahy. And well, what was he? A Chickasaw. And so again, they're asking some questions, but then came some statements in the file that kind of touched me to read them and kind of made me a little bit sad to see them. And the question was, well, how big was he when the war closed? About 20 years old. And then they asked him directly, well, how big was you when the war closed? I was about 10. I was about 15 or 16. I recollect the war good. Do you recollect when James Lanahy sold his mother? He's asking now that question to Albert Byrd. Who did he sell her to? Billy Gear. Was this man sold? They're talking about Isom. And no, sir. No. And you realize, wait a minute, they sold this man's mother. And they're talking about this. This is the 1890s now. And they're talking about that. And then Isom comes back and he has to tell these strangers, my father and mother were sold, and also a boy by the name of Henry. There were 3 of them sold. And I imagine the pain of him telling these people that. And they're just kind of dismissive. And where do you live? Towson County, 4 miles from Dokesville. And of course, the conclusion is that, okay, they were enrolled as Chickasaw freedmen. But of course, we know later they were transferred to the Choctaw roll. Again, but one thing is interesting that came out of the original file as well. Again, someone else was asked if they were acquainted with him. And yes, sir, he knew Isom Jackson fairly well. Do you know whether he was sold at the time his mother was sold? No, he was not sold. He belonged to, it should be Lanahy, but old Lanahaw. Do you know the name of the one that went with his mother when she was sold? Yes, sir. Henry. And again, it's one of those things that makes you pause because you realize, yes, people were sold away from their children. Families were split up in Indian Territory. As much as people might want to say that, oh, it was a kinder, gentler form of enslavement, slavery is a violation of the human spirit. And that just has to be said, even in this particular case. We do know that he did get a land allotment, and in those files, and this took place until the beginning of that land allotment 5 years later. Now, this is 1904, and we see that there was Isom applying for his own land allotment. You also get to see, other things in terms of the land description. You even see, and if you look very, very hard in that range, you can actually see shaded in right by that number 4. There's a little bit of a shaded area representing the 40 acres that were allotted to Isom Jackson, and you can see that on that plat map. So the outcome was that they were admitted to the roll, or their names were put on the roll, pretty much without complication. There were no further questions asked about Isom, nor any in-depth questions about his wife or his children. And basically, one can say from this set of data, from the Dawes data, that this is just an uncomplicated story, or so it appears to be. But there is more. There's a lot more to find. You're invited to stay tuned for part 2 of the Isom and Julia Jackson story. There is so much more to tell. Also, of course, if you are interested in learning more about other families from Indian Territory, volumes 1 and 2 of Freedmen of the Frontier, which stemmed out of a year-long project to document 52 freedmen families in 52 weeks. This project was put into book form and is divided into 2 volumes. Both volumes are now available on Amazon. If you're interested also in joining a community of other researchers who are telling stories, telling their stories, finding other stories from families from the territory, you are encouraged to join the Oklahoma Freedmen Collective. This is Angela Walton-Raji, and I thank you, and stay tuned for part 2. See you next time.